Yeah, thank you, Jun. So we need to control the time. I will be a little bit quick on this topic because this is probably the third time I talk about epilepsy. In some previous Biospark Monthly news, we talk about Neurona, which is cell replacement therapy for epilepsy. Then last year, I talked about Jazz Pharmaceutical had a deal with Saniona, and it's a Danish company, very small company, but it's interesting that they do a very interesting deal for a preclinical asset. They pay 42.5 million US dollar just for a preclinical asset. So that's a very interesting. That's why the epilepsy still has a lot of room to grow in terms of the therapeutic area. So here I just want to introduce epilepsy slightly differently. As I previously mentioned, the term seizure and epilepsy are very similar, but the seizure refer to one episode. If you have repeated seizure, then you're starting to have a syndrome called epilepsy. So that's why the two terms, there's a subtle difference. And then, of course, in terms of classification, there's different way depending on the cortex, the area. Some of the seizure are focal onset, meaning you have a localized area of onset. Some seizure or epilepsy is much more general across the whole brain surface. That's why the EEG remained the gold standard to really have a detailed diagnosis. And interestingly, Haolan will talk about the next topic. There's a rare disease called Dravet syndrome, which Haolan, the second topic we talk about. And the Dravet syndrome, the main symptom is related to seizure or epilepsy. Of course, it's more complicated than just the seizure. So Haolan's topic will talk about that. That's why Dravet syndrome, I want to people realize there's a close connection. And then go to the next slide. I'm going to quickly introduce the current landscape. June, can you move to the next slide? Yeah. So this is the current molecular targets being targeted. That's the difficulty for any drug developers to enter the seizure therapeutic area is there's so many existing treatment. So now generically people call that anti-seizure medication or ASM. There are at least 30 of ASM already on the market. A different line of therapy. It's a very complicated algorithm to decide what drug to use for the first line, what to use for the second line, and the later lines. And basically, you can think those ASM already approved by FDA belong to four major categories. One is a modulator of voltage-gated ion channel. So if you think about the basic physiology, the sodium channel and the potassium channel, they all contribute to the action potential. But to treat epilepsy, you need to open the potassium channel and try to block the sodium channel. So that's the opposite direction. So that's why the voltage-gated ion channel family is a very important class of epilepsy targets. Then GABA-mediated compounds are often very much a standard of care in terms of, especially the GABA-mediated inhibition. You want to probably modulate and to boost that inhibition so that a seizure is basically a abnormal activation of the cortical neurons. So then another class of targets is ionotropic glutamate receptor being overactive. That's why it's the excitatory synapse. For those, you probably need an inhibitor of those ionotropic glutamate receptor, especially the AMPA receptor. Then finally, also neurotransmitter release. There's modulator of synaptic neurotransmitter release. If you modulate that, that can also become a potential therapeutic target. So basically, what's highlighted in red in this diagram is those drugs approved in the last 12 years, since 2014. So that's a very recent approval. But some of the drugs already on the market have multiple mechanisms. They're targeting multiple targets. Some of them target one target. So that's a subtle difference in terms of the kind of therapeutic landscape. If we move to the next slide, that's previously when I talk about Saniona, it's kind of a little bit slow. And I use that slide to talk about in general, what's the potassium channel? Is the slide moving? Or yeah, so that's the reason potassium channel got people's attention because of genetics. There's some genetic disease called benign familial neonatal epilepsy, or BFNE. For those particular epilepsy, they eventually is pretty benign. It's not a major debilitation for the patients when they grow up. But from those studies, because they're familial, they identify two particular potassium channel, Kv7.2 and Kv7.3. So that voltage-gated potassium channel turned out to contribute to something called a M current. M current is electrophysiologists initially, when they study epilepsy, they try to understand what is that particular current. Then what behind that electric signal, it's these two particular potassium channel. And it's important to be specifically targeting Kv7.2 and Kv7.3, because if you also hit Kv7.1, 4, 5, that can lead some potential tolerability or safety issue. So the more specifically you can hit, or you can boost, you can open 7.2 and 7.3, the better. So that's why Saniona's compound also targeting 7.3 and 7.3, 2 and 3, and whereas Xenon, the first in class, Xenon, and they're already in phase 3. Last time when I talked about Saniona, they also have probably the first in class channel opener for 7.2 and 7.3. Let's go to the next slide. That's the current landscape. At that time, when I talked about last year, people already know that Xenon listed here, already in phase 3, they are guaranteed to be the first in class to drive the whole global epilepsy market. Then Saniona only preclinical, but they still got $42 million. But the problem is, once you saw the data, I will share later. Once you see Xenon's data being so good, that pretty much poses more difficulty for Saniona's compound to going through clinical development. Now you have a higher bar to cross, because when people working on similar target or similar approach of therapeutics, usually you wish your competitor's data is positive so that justify or validate the whole class, but you also wish your competitor's data is not too good. Then in this case, unfortunately to Saniona or Jazz, Xenon's data is very impressive, meaning it's very difficult for Saniona Jazz compound to even getting close to Xenon's efficacy. So that's really bad news to their competitor. So if we move to the next slide, it's just let's just give a quick overview without diving too deep in the phase 3 study. So what the Xenon study called X-TOLE2, the X-TOLE study was a phase 2b study, already showing pretty good data. The X-TOLE2 is their phase 3 data, and they have a 1-to-1-to-1 randomization. So 1/3 of patients receive placebo, 1/3 of the patients receiving this compound called AZK. So this AZK drug have different dose. So they tried the 15 milligram dose for daily dosing, QD. Then they have the 25 milligram. So this is a very straightforward design, but all those treatment, the 15 and 25, once after 12 weeks of treatment, they gave the patients option to go an open label extension if they want to continue. Then if they don't want to continue, they can wait for another 8 weeks to do a final kind of follow-up to wrap up whatever their clinical trial participation. So the primary endpoint for this trial is just you compare AZK with the placebo at 12 weeks and to see if the what's so-called the monthly frequency, so the monthly percentage change of the epilepsy or seizure frequency has a significant reduction. So that's the key primary endpoint. But they also have some durability secondary endpoint like RR50 or RR90 or even exploratory. You can even testing RR100, which I won't go into too much detail. Then of course, safety and tolerability need to be continually monitored because there's so many drugs already on the market. The bar is pretty high for the safety margin. So go to the next slide. That's the study population. You can see one of the opportunities for new drug developer in the epilepsy area is there's so many patients still treatment resistant. Even there's almost 30 FDA approved drugs on the market. There's still many patients try 3 different ASMs, still doesn't work very well. So there's quite a large population are treatment-resistant epilepsy. That's why in their trial of phase 3, you can see quite a number of them are treatment-resistant. For example, a median of their patient already receiving 5 prior ASM treatment. At least 5 ASM has not worked for those patients. Then on average, some of the patient, 51% patient in this trial are receiving 3 concomitant ASM. They're taking 3 different drugs simultaneously. Now they're adding this AZK drug as a clinical trial. That tells you quite a number of population are resistant to the existing therapy. Then the baseline seizure frequency is pretty frequent, about 12.75 per month. That's every 2 or 3 days. These patients will have a seizure. That's very kind of painful for those patients. So that means for this population, patient population, there's a strong unmet medical need. That's why this data is very encouraging. If we move to the next slide for the primary endpoint, that, yeah, the most surprising thing is that their phase 3 outperformed their phase 2b. Their phase 2b already pretty good data, but their phase 3 data is even better in terms of a monthly percentage change, just counting the seizure frequency, which is pretty straightforward. And you can see the 15 milligram dose already have an improvement of 34%, but the placebo effect is always there. Yes, that's why placebo always have something. So placebo showed 10% of improvement from baseline, but the lower dose, 15 milligram, very significantly, already pretty significant to 34.5%. But the 25 milligram dose, even better. In terms of placebo-adjusted monthly percentage change, it's 42.7%. That's one of the best percentage change you ever seen. But of course, the higher dose, 25 milligram, also have tolerability safety issues. That's why eventually, once this goes into FDA, probably the starting dose will be 15. The 15, they're pretty happy with the safety profile. But overall, yeah, that's, if we move to the next slide, that can tells you that phase 2b, phase 3 data, it's very rare. It's usually phase 3 data not as good as phase 2, but still significant. But in this case, their phase 3, once you expand the patient population, they can do even better. So that's very encouraging. Of course, phase 3, they also do a little bit, they have an arm doing 12 weeks compared to the phase 2b only do 8 weeks. Then you can see even looking at apple-to-apple comparison, just 25 milligram in phase 2 at 8 weeks give you 34.6% improvement from baseline. And then 25 milligram at 12 weeks adjusted on placebo, you can get 42.7%. So that's quite impressed. They're very happy with the data. And let's move on to the next slide, is the safety. Yeah, so the safety, you can tell, the 25 milligrams still have a pretty high percentage compared to placebo, right? So the TEAEs, overall, the 15 milligram, the lower dose, very similar to placebo. So that means the tolerability with 15 milligram is really good. The most common TEAEs are dizziness, somnolence, meaning kind of dream walk, and headache and fatigue. You can see that between the placebo group and the lower dose group, it's very comparable. But of course, if you really look at the 25 milligram, that percentage is quite high. Right? That means patient will be decided by the physician. The neurologist decide if the lower dose doesn't work very well as effectively, they can adjust dose. But the starting dose probably most likely will be the 15 milligram. So generally, it's pretty well tolerated. There's not too much surprise. And the efficacy, the most amazing thing is the p-value is so small. There's a lot of 0.00 in the p-value. So next, go to the next slide. So this is definitely very good news for Xenon. So they're going to file NDA application by the 3rd quarter of this year. But because there's so many drugs on the market, it won't get any accelerated approval. It will be a regular approval. Most likely end of 2027, beginning of 2028, it will eventually get FDA approval. So it's still taking some time because there's so many competing drugs on the market. Then in terms of the whole landscape, I also want to point out that the whole thing does not stop here. Just having more sodium channel modulator won't be the end of the story. And you will see that by more and more understanding of the biology, pathophysiology, people starting to pay more attention to microglia, to astrocyte, to immune cells. So far, all the existing therapy are focusing on the neurons. So that's one area you can see a lot of phase 2 and phase 3 compound already in development, targeting the microglia, the astrocyte, immune cell, other cell types. But I also want to mention in my previous sharing at the BioSpark Monthly News, Neurology is a very interesting company. It will offer allogenic cell replacement therapy for the inhibitory interneuron, GABAergic neuron. That potentially it's a one-time treatment. If it can hold on to the efficacy, that means you don't need to take a daily dose of pills. So I'm also hopeful that Neurona, by getting more and more data for the cell replacement therapy, will also give us another treatment modality. So that's the last slide I have, and I see some question. Yeah, Ricardo made a comment, cell context. Yeah, that's a very interesting comment.